I'm Adrian Marshall. I'm the facilitator of the Grassy Plains Network. Before we go any further, I perhaps should just acknowledge the country I'm on, which is the lands of the Wurundjeri people, and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and to any First Nations people who are here today. I'd also like to, I suppose, say a sincere thank you, for want of a better word, to the First Nations people all across the Victorian volcanic plain who have done preserve the grasslands that we all here love and that we managed to, as colonialists, trash in a brief 200 years. So yes, thank you and apologies. I suppose it's yeah. I'll let Michael and Anne introduce themselves. Needless to say, they're yes. Well, yeah. Well, I'll let Michael and Anne introduce themselves. I think that's the easiest way of going. Perhaps if you'd like to share your screens and please. But sorry, I should say too. Questions. I expect put your questions in the chat and we'll deal with them at the end. But I expect you could probably leap in and interrupt the speakers too if you're so inclined. But I'll definitely keep an eye on the chat and we'll just see how it goes. And yeah, okay. Thank you, Michael. Anne, please.
Yeah, Anne, I'll leave it to you to go first, I think.
Thanks, Michael. I'll start the screen sharing if I can. My name's Anne McGregor. I've been involved in Merri Creek groups, organisations since 1976. So I have quite an interesting experience of watching the transformation along the creek and some of the campaigns that we've run to save patches of grassland, native basalt plains grassland that remain next to the creek or nearby the Merri Creek catchment. So I'll be talking a bit about how some of those grassland reserves came into being, and then Michael Longmore will outline the values of those reserves and their management. So I'd also like to echo Adrian's acknowledgement of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation for their stewardship and care of the grasslands and the grassy woodlands of the Merri catchment, and pay respect to their elders past and present. So first of all, a bit of a disclaimer. Inevitably, my account of the history of establishing the grassland reserves is incomplete, so apologies in advance to anyone listening who was involved at the time and who might have a different perspective on how things happened. So first, before I get into the actual reserves, I think it might help to explain a bit of the context that the main community organisations involved that I'll be talking about. A number of local community groups with an interest in Merri Creek came together with the local councils in the northern suburbs to form the Merri Creek Coordinating Committee in 1976. The initial focus was on planting Indigenous vegetation, constructing a shared path, and fighting a proposed freeway with associated concrete lining of the Merri Creek. So the freeway, the F2 for the Hume Freeway was going to come right down the Merri Creek Valley through the suburbs to Clifton Hill. In 1988, the Friends of Merri Creek Incorporated was established as an umbrella group for lots of local groups. And the following year, the Merri Creek Management Committee Incorporated was set up. It had a major breakthrough in having staff employed for ecological restoration. So our efforts up to that time had been fairly piecemeal, and in terms of volunteer groups, not particularly successful. So things really got moving with some dedicated and skilled staff doing the restoration work. So both the Friends of Merri Creek and the Merri Creek Management Committee have been very active ever since then and drawn in many organisations and individuals to work towards what is still a shared environmental and social vision for the Merri and its tributaries. So onto the grassland reserves. there's a map here, thank you, Michael, of the Merri Creek catchment outlined in green. At the southern end there, Abbotsford, the Merri Creek flows into the Yarra River, Clifton Hill, Abbotsford, and moving upstream through the inner suburbs of Fitzroy, North Fitzroy, Northcote, Brunswick, Coburg, Preston, and Fawkner, we get to the Babi-Jinneneng on Central Creek, which is a tributary of the Merri in Reservoir, is one of the grassland reserves. Then Narri-Jarrang on the Fawkner side of the creek, at the end of Duke's Road in Fawkner. Galata Tambor is not, there's a patch of grassland there, was purchased by Melbourne Water's predecessor for a retarding basin site, but it's got a beautiful gorge along the creek and is now part of the Merri Creek Parklands. Then we have a bit further north, Bababi Marning or Cooper Street grasslands in Campbellfield, and Galginyak or Craigieburn grasslands in east of Craigieburn. So they're the main ones that I'll be talking about tonight. Michael might refer to some other ones. There are certainly a few other remnant areas further north, but I'll be focusing on these existing reserves. So Bababi Mining, back on Cooper Street. Can you see my cursor there? Can people see that? Yeah. Bababi Mining here, it's that long, narrow, bright green strip. That was our longest and in the end only partially successful campaign for grassland protection. Cooper Street grasslands are now known by the Woiwurrung name. All those names I've mentioned are Woiwurrung names. Back in 1985, the Arthur Rylah Institute published John Stuvey's landmark survey and assessment of Western Basalt Plains grasslands, and he identified the Cooper Street grassland on the western bank of Merri Creek, just on the south side of Cooper Street, as being of extremely high conservation value. David Cheel, some of you would know David, undertook a botanical assessment of the grasslands for the Department of Conservation, Forests and Lands in 1988. He found that the 72 hectares, as it was then, area was large enough for sympathetic management to be implemented to ensure the persistence of the threatened species and communities. So from 1987, the Merri mob, so friends, the community volunteers, and then the Merri Creek Coordinating Committee and subsequently the Management Committee worked towards public acquisition of those grasslands. The Friends tried all sorts of things. We organised surveys, we met with ministers and local members of parliament. We lobbied before state and federal elections. We made freedom of information requests. We held a grassland bus tour. We achieved almost weekly coverage in northern suburbs newspapers. And I should move on to, there's a scene of Bababi Mining. You can see a bit of gorse there, which is an ongoing problem. But we produced an 8-page Metropolitan Park proposal that covers there the natural refuge for the northern suburbs. Pretty rough and ready publication, as you can see. Not beautifully presented like modern publications, but it was quite important, I think, in presenting a vision and a concept for the Cooper Street grasslands and Galata Tambor to the south, and ideally the Craigieburn grasslands to the north. So that was dated July 1989. The newspaper clipping on the left is referring to a 1929 Metropolitan Town Planning Commission report on Melbourne that suggested there should be a big park in that same Campbellfield area, Metropolitan Park really for Melbourne, for northern Melbourne. So that's why the journalists thought we were reviving a 60-year-old plan in suggesting a Metropolitan Park there. So that proposal, that natural refuge for the northern suburbs proposal, was presented to the Minister for Conservation and the local member for Broadmeadows on a deputation which had a range of organisations represented. So Friends of Merri Creek were there. There was the Fawkner Progress Association, the Conservation Council of Victoria, which is now Environment Victoria, and the Victorian National Parks Association. So we drew in other organisations to support the campaign. There was a collection of papers about the Cooper Street grasslands published by the Parrot Natural History Network and Bob McDonald in 1990. That booklet included a paper about the plants by Graham Lorimer and John Reed, and there was one about the fauna by Damien Cook. And the Friends organised a rally at the grassland with a few speakers and a very small crowd holding some placards. It wasn't exactly a media stunt. I don't think any of the media turned up for the rally, but someone else had tipped off the police that Cooper Street would be blocked to traffic and there could be some trouble. So we were greeted by several police officers when we turned up for the rally, and we assured them that we wouldn't make any trouble, and please could they assist us by ensuring that people's cars were parked so that they wouldn't obstruct the traffic. So the police were very helpful about that. This photo was taken at the rally to emphasise that grasslands are best appreciated from a position close to the ground and most easily done by small people. So that's our daughter on the right there. We don't even know who the other girls are and whether they've grown up to appreciate grasslands or not, but we hope so. The Cooper Street grasslands were definitely threatened. Urban development was spreading northwards, and an industrial subdivision was proposed for the grasslands to the west of the freeway reservation, which was, as I said, running right along the Merri Valley and slicing the grasslands too as well. When the department inquired of the owner's estate agent, the asking price for the property in August 1989 was $10.5 million, which was a lot of money in those days. That was probably vastly an inflated number, as a local licensed valuer estimated its value at around $5 million. However, apparently the department didn't secure a sworn valuation, but decided that they needed to find a less costly grassland reserve instead. The 400-hectare Craigieburn grasslands, which are now called Galginiak to the north, filled the bill for the department because it had a greater diversity of plant species and significant fauna values at less than a third the asking price of Cooper Street. It wasn't on the edge of the suburb at that stage and wasn't industrial zoning. So the minister announced that the Craigieburn grasslands would be purchased in May 1991 as part of a linear park along the Merri between Marnie's Road and Craigieburn. Eventually, about a third only of the Cooper Street grasslands, 23 hectares, were purchased by the state government in 1992, and the rest were obliterated under factories and warehouses. That was despite public objections in 1991 by organisations like the Australian Conservation Foundation, so we were going national, the Conservation Council of Victoria and the VNPA, along with the Friends and Merri Creek Management Committee. In fact, the Aborigines Advancement League in 1991 called for the grasslands to be a sanctuary managed by Aborigines and used for education, training and employment for revegetation workers. So that was a very early interesting concept that no doubt led to the NARAP team of the Wurundjeri Corporation. So on to the Craigieburn grasslands, Galginiak. So we didn't have to advocate for protection of Galginiak because the department decided it was better value for money than Cooper Street, so they bought it, and it's managed by Parks Victoria, like Cooper Street. But in the late 1990s into the early 2000s, we certainly fought long and hard to remove the F2 Craigieburn bypass freeway reservation from the Merri Valley and from the two big grassland reserves. That's a whole other story I won't go into tonight, but as part of that campaign, Friends of Merri Creek members successfully nominated both the Cooper Street and the Craigieburn grasslands, together with a link 200 metres wide each side of Merri Creek, to the Register of the National Estate in 1998. Ultimately, the route of the bypass was moved to the east out of the valley and the grasslands. I think that was considerably due to the efforts of many hundreds of people who joined that campaign, the community campaign, organised mainly by the Friends of Merri Creek. So just quickly, another couple of reserves, Narri Jarang on Central Creek and Bababi Jinanang, Dukes Road, Fawkner. The the freeway reservation along the Merri Valley was actually good for something. It prevented subdivision and building on quite a swathe of land, and parts of which did retain basalt plains grassland. One of those areas was on Davidson Street Reservoir, grasslands along Central Creek. And in 1991 and 92, Merri Creek Management Committee harvested seed for revegetation projects elsewhere from those grasslands. Both MCMC and the Friends opposed Melbourne Water plans to subdivide. There's a part of our campaign to save the Central Creek grasslands. Opposed plans to subdivide and sell the grassland, which was of state significance, in 1992. Managed to hold off those plans until 2001, when the Friends presented at a planning panel that was hearing submissions on a rezoning proposal by the Urban Land Corporation for 15 hectares at around Davidson Street, including the grasslands. Paul Gibson-Roy appeared as an expert witness with the Friends, and Friends argued that 11 hectares of the 15 hectares of high quality grassland should be protected, not built on. But the Urban Land Corporation's proposal for a 9-hectare reserve was ultimately approved and successful. So part of this campaign, we had postcards, we had T-shirts, and the MCMC's manager had, I think, oh no, it might have been the Friends, organised this with a local real estate agent. They produced a not for sale sign, and young Bob Brown there did a bit of a media stunt with a speech about the values of the grasslands there. That would have been in the late 1990s, I think. So that got quite a good media coverage, certainly in local papers. In those days, local newspapers were a good way of getting coverage on issues such as ours. But as I say, well, I suppose 9-hectare reserve is a lot better than could have happened. Could have been completely covered in houses. And MCMC has been managing that reserve for a long time, as Michael will tell you soon. The last reserve I was going to mention was the grassland near Merri Creek at the eastern end of Duke's Road in Fawkner. So that's Bababi Jinanang, which was also protected in inverted commas by the freeway reservation. It is Crown land with Merri Beck Council as Committee of Management, and it's been managed by MCMC for many years. Just another angle. So we didn't stop at those urban grassland reserves once they were created, because we were looking further upstream in the Merri Creek catchment at some of the other significant remnant grasslands and grassy eucalypt woodlands. Produced this proposal for a Merri State Park in 2000, along with the Victorian National Parks Association, and there's the grassland components there, which I've mentioned: Duke's Road, Central Creek. Barry Road grassland was on the edge of Gallardo Tambor there. It's now part of that parkland area and managed by Parks Victoria. Bababi Marning on Cooper Street, Craigieburn East grasslands were northeast of Craigieburn Reserve. There's the Craigieburn Grassland Reserve. Part now of one of the conservation areas designated under the Melbourne Strategic Assessment for the growth corridor. Bald Hill is another one further north, partly affected by quarrying and owned by Boral. I think both of them are owned by Boral, most of those sites. Anyway, we were presenting a bigger proposal. We can see that there's green linkages along the Merri and along Malcolm Creek to Mount Ridley Reserve, and there were other sites of significance for various heritage reasons and other reasons that we included in that state park proposal. The total area was about 2,500 hectares, and there's current plans being produced by the state government for Marambaba parklands, which do cover a lot of that area land. one of the other interesting tactics used by the Friends of Merri Creek, along with Friends of the Earth, which were a little bit more militant, I think, than we usually were, was a blockade for a gas pipeline, which was originally aligned through the southern edge of Galginiark, the Craigieburn grasslands, and through a wetland on the a road reserve. It was to supply a power station that was going to, a gas power station, gas turbine, that has been constructed, and in fact the gas pipeline did go through despite the blockade. This was in 2001, and probably punctured the impervious layer that retained water under the wetland where there were growling grass frogs. So I don't think the wetland has been as good ever since that construction. But as a sort of compensation for the ecological damage done by the gas pipeline, the company did set up a growling grass frog trust and put money in trust with Trust for Nature for growling grass frog habitat work, and that's only recently been fully expended on various projects for growling grass frog in the Merri Creek catchment or along the creek. I think they wouldn't have been obliged to do that if there hadn't been such an outcry against the damage wrought by the pipeline. Anyway, Melbourne's urban growth boundary, as you're probably all aware, was massively expanded from 2008, and it took in most of the Merri catchment, and the Friends had to keep campaigning to protect what was left of our native vegetation. And in 2008, we sent a Christmas card. That's the card unfolded. So the cover was on the right, with a nice image of red gums and grassland in the Merri catchment at Merri. And this was sent to all our local members of Parliament and the local councillors, with inside a map showing our proposed conservation network. All the stuff in green was pretty much conservation landscapes, either conservation farming or protected reserves, and the pink area is was then the extended urban growth boundary, which in fact ultimately went beyond up included Wallen, so it got even larger. So we were presenting a positive vision, saying we could keep parklands, habitat links, and rural landscapes that sustain natural ecosystems, as well as providing recreation spaces. We thought we could planning could achieve that, as well as providing urban settlements for millions of people. In fact, 5 million people. I think we've exceeded that now. So we kept working on this concept. Green wedges were being steadily eroded and reduced. Certainly our green wedge virtually disappeared through that urban growth boundary expansion. Here we have a fat-tailed dunnart on the left and the growling grass frog. Members of Friends of Merri Creek. In fact, I think that's me on the left. At a protest, a Green Wedges protest in Collins Street, outside the Ministry for Planning and Environment offices in 2009. So we, as I said, we used all sorts of tactics to get our message through. But the Melbourne Strategic Assessment under the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act that was undertaken as part of this, the urban planning for Melbourne's urban growth, was we certainly engaged in that process as strongly as we could, but it was very much a disappointment, I'd say. It was very rushed. There was inadequate survey work. The prescription that specified 150 hectare minimum for volcanic plains grassland immediately sacrificed most of the sites within the urban growth corridors. And the offsets from clearing our grasslands in the Northern Growth Corridor are to go to the Western Grassland Reserve, which isn't much help to us. The conservation areas, we had a conservation network idea, again, just a slight refinement of that one in the Christmas card. So all the green areas plus the orange areas were ones we thought should be protected. But that's what's we've ended up with, the purple bits. The conservation areas that emerged from the Melbourne Strategic Assessment, initially the areas that were initially identified have been steadily whittled away through a series of review processes and further information from consultants and so on that the department accepted. So they've got smaller steadily. And probably the worst thing is that the establishment of the conservation areas as conservation reserves depends on urban development of the surrounding land, and that could take up to 2050. Meanwhile, there's no obligation or even incentive to undertake active management to conserve those EPBC listed species or communities that supposedly are being protected by those conservation areas. So we're not very satisfied with that whole process. We're still advocating for protection and conservation management of our grasslands and the other native vegetation communities in the catchment. We still write submissions to strategic planning processes. We appear at planning panels for precinct structure plans. We write to ministers and encourage our members to do the same. We meet with members of parliament. We organise talks and tours, as Adrian does too, and utilise social media to raise public awareness. So just to sum up on our activities before Michael gets down to the more on the ground activities. As my partner Bruce put it in a paper about important elements of a successful community campaign, our successes can be boiled down to 4 Ps. Firstly, being positive with a positive vision, positive proposals with clear benefits instead of just opposing things. Being professional, having well-prepared submissions and well-reasoned arguments, and utilising all the skills and knowledge in the community group's membership. I think that's really important. It's been very valuable for the Friends of Merri Creek. Thirdly, you need to be politically aware because you are acting to change the allocation of resources towards a new set of priorities. We need to try and get local and state and even federal politicians on your side, as well as the bureaucrats, the people who work for local and state and federal government. And finally, being persistent. I think anyone who's been involved in the conservation game for long would be well aware of that. Bruce rather cheekily put it as a 5-year rule for community groups to be successful. They must persist for at least 5 years. You could expand on that one, I think, because after 5 years, most obstructing bureaucrats do go away. So we can only hope. So I'll leave it on that note and hand over to Michael.
Thanks, Anne. And should we wait for questions till I'm done, or do you want to? Yeah, let's just wait. Okay. All right. Yeah, so I'm going to, I'm Michael Longmore, by the way. I am one of the staff at Merri Creek Management Committee. I've been there for about 14 years. And in my current role, I manage our ecological restoration program, which involves on-ground management of some, at least, of the reserves that Anne talked about. So yeah, I'm going to hone in on, I guess, 5 of the reserves, all of which were featured in the campaigns and just discussed, and then I'll allude briefly to some of the values in the northern part of the catchment as well. So everything that I'm going to be talking about here is in, I guess, the lowest third of the Merri. The majority of the Merri is actually still much further to the north. So we'll start at the southernmost of the grasslands in the Merri Creek Parklands, which is Bubba grassland in Fawkner. If I can manage to, here we go. Move to the next slide. So Bubba together with Nari Jarring, they're both just to the south of the Ring Road, and they have a lot in common. They're both Crown Land Reserves, but with councils acting as committee of management. So that's Merribeck Council in the case of Bubba and Darebin Council in the case of Nari Jarring. They're both also very much urban grasslands. Nari Jarring is entirely surrounded by houses. Bubba has housing coming up pretty close to it, just across the creek from it. In fact, as we remember every time we burn it and offend the residents hidden away in a different municipality. So yeah, both of them are council managed reserves, and then MCMC has been engaged by councils to manage those grasslands, both for just over 30 years now. Babui-Jinanang, which is in Faulkner, in Merri, it's a reserve of about 5 hectares in total. 4 hectares of that is natural temperate grassland of the Victorian Volcanic Plain, so the federally listed community. It's of quite varied quality, so there are some quite decent patches of grassland in the rockier parts of the reserve, but a lot of the area is also quite degraded as a result of previous land uses. So the westernmost third of the grassland was frequently slashed up until probably 15 years ago. And when you look at aerial photos from the 1940s, some of the other sections of the grassland even seem to have had some sort of cropping going on in them at some points in time. But we're managing the area as a whole, but it does mean there's some quite substantial weed issues to deal with through some parts of the reserve. So the reserve is quite well known because of its large population of matted flax lily, so another federally endangered species, Dinella amina. When the reserve was gazetted, it was thought by some to be the largest known population, but since then, in the intervening 30 years, there have been quite a number of other matted flax lily populations found, so I don't think this is the biggest one. There's probably somewhere of around 100 colonies of the plant in the grassland, and they're a mixture of remnant colonies and colonies that were translocated into the site when the Hume bypass was built up by Craigieburn 15 to 20 years ago. So as a result of the slashing and cropping and whatever else I was talking about before, we've got Chilean needlegrass scattered throughout the grassland. It's present in pretty much every part of the reserve, even in the high quality areas, but there are some areas which are just pure swards of Chilean needlegrass with no native values to speak of. The funding that we get through Merri Council allows us to undertake different management activities, burning, which is probably one of the most key ones. We divide the grassland up into about 3 or 4 different sections and burn a section each year. So it's a 3 to 4 year burn cycle, depending on seasonal variability. We might burn more frequently when we have a string of La Niñas, and less frequently in drought years when there isn't the same degree of biomass accumulation, but roughly a 3-year burn cycle. And then that's followed up by lots of intense weed control, primarily with herbicides, and that's almost entirely these days targeting Chilean needlegrass, focusing on the high quality areas to stop it encroaching into those areas, and then creating sort of buffers around them. We don't really have sufficient funds to deal with the more intractable swards of Chilean needlegrass, so that's something that we seek external funds, grants through state and federal agencies to try and target another strategic blob of Chilean needlegrass at a time, where we consider that native values have been more or less obliterated, and so we're looking at kind of starting from scratch in those Chilean blobs of using more extreme herbicides and then planting them out with dense patches of Themata and not much else, just to keep them simple and easy to manage. The grassland has had a huge amount of involvement from the local community over the decades as well. So it's not just us working out there. We've been helped by the Friends of Merri Creek in many different activities over the years. Their Wednesday volunteer group often end up at Babui-Jinanang probably 2 or 3 times a year, I would say. More recently, a friends group dedicated to the grassland has formed, which is the Queer Mates of Babui-Jinanang, so Friends of Merri Creek's LGBTIQ subgroup, and they've adopted the grassland and have held a string of probably 5 or 6 activities a year for the last 3 or 4 years, focused on the grasslands and different aspects of management that the public can involve themselves in. As I mentioned, there's quite a lot of matted flax lily in the reserve, but it's also quite an interesting reserve in that most of the native herbs that remain here are all lilies. The peas and daisies have pretty much dropped out. So there's the matted flax lily there, but we've also got classics like your chocolate lily, which you find everywhere, but also the nodding chocolate lily. Arthropodium fimbriatum is present here as well, which we don't really have anywhere else on the Merri. There's also the pale vanilla lily growing here and a few bulbine lilies. Moving over to Nari Jarang, so over in Reservoir, this grassland, Darebin Council is the land manager, and they've been engaging us under contract since the early 90s to manage the grassland on their behalf. It's larger than Bababijinanang, so there's about 9 hectares of natural temperate grassland here. Like Bababijinanang, it also hosts matted flax lily population, which is not quite as extensive as the one at Bababijinanang, but it's also got quite an array of other threatened species. So this one is quite herb rich, this grassland, at least some portions of it are. If you ever happen to be out there in spring, over the next month or so, south of Davidson Street is where you're going to find the most delightful parts. Some of those are threatened species. So there's a semi-aquatic herb called shortwater starwort that exists in some of the wet depressions within the reserve. In the drier areas, where there's shallow soil on the edge of boulders, there's quite extensive patches of rye beetle grass, which is a state threatened species. And then we've also used the grassland as a bit of a laboratory to trial methods of reintroducing some of the other threatened species in the catchment. And I'll touch on that in a moment. But even threatened species aside, there's a lot of really quite spectacular common wildflowers that inhabit this grassland. We manage the grassland in quite a similar fashion to Bababijinanang, so burning is a key part of its management. Because of the larger size and slightly greater complexity in the variety of different communities present in the reserve, it's broken up into 8 or 9 management zones, I think. So there are some stony knolls in the northwestern corner of the reserve, which are burnt much less frequently to allow a bit of shrubby vegetation to establish, which provides great habitat for a mob of grey kangaroos, which have permanently set up camp in the grassland, despite the houses all around. And other sections of the grassland, again, burnt on more or less a 3 to 4 year cycle. The contract with Darebin also allows for some edge management, so acknowledging that we're stuck right in the middle of suburbia here. There are a lot of houses and roads right around the perimeter, people's properties backing directly onto the grassland, so trying to manage that space in a way that's both makes things less terrifying for the residents when you get summer wildfires, but also helping to try and reduce some of the edge effects for weed invasion into the reserve. Yep, so fire is a key part of that. Lots and lots of follow-up work with herbicide. We've more or less managed to remove, I guess, the woody weeds that were really widespread across the knolls, pretty much gone from the reserve. Phalaris has been pushed out of a lot of the lower areas, though there are still some strongholds. And Chilean needlegrass has mostly been restricted to around the perimeter. It hasn't gained too much of a foothold through the centre of the grassland. But yeah, I touched on a moment ago that we have been using this grassland as a laboratory. We've, over the course of 30 years, you plant many tens of thousands of plants. Our experience was that most of the daisies that we planted, and particularly a few key types of daisy, plain Siam daisy being the one in the photo here, never survived. If you planted them from tube stock, they might live for a year or two and then they'd die, which we believe is due to with how the formation of taproots occurs when you put plants that have deep taproots and that need to survive the summer by tapping into water deep below the ground. When you grow them in a tube, their roots are pretty much restricted to the depth of the tube, so they're not going to go where they need to go in the summertime. So we've done a lot of work here trialing methods combining direct seeding with small-scale soil disturbance to try and favour better taproot formation, and that's been quite successful in introducing particularly daisy species into the grassland. So Plains yam daisy being the one here in the photo, but we've also tried it with common everlastings and swamp everlastings and those sorts of things and had quite good results. If we head a bit further north, we've got a couple of the Parks Victoria grasslands here. So we're just north of the Western Ring Road and adjacent to the Hume bypass. Galata Tambor here in the centre, and then Bubby Marning, which is the Cooper Street grasslands. So I'm just focusing here mostly on, so the green boundaries here are referring to Parks Victoria managed land, but at Galata Tambor, as Anne mentioned before, there is also quite a substantial basin that Melbourne Water own, and there's the Barry Road Gorge cutting through that basin, which is quite a significant geological feature along the perimeter of that grassland. But the grasslands themselves are pretty much restricted to this Parks Victoria land up the top here. Both grasslands are host again to an array of threatened species. Galata Tambor probably has a greater variety than Bubby Marning. Bubby Marning is well known for the large golden sun moth population it supports, but there's a few threatened species there as well. Other threatened species, matted flax lily, rye beetle grass, and so forth. But Galata Tambor, particularly on its stony rises and the sort of stony rise wetlands trapped between those stony rises, supports some really interesting stuff. So here's Galata Tambor looking from the rusty Ned Kelly Bridge, as it's sometimes called, that crosses the Hume Freeway. So you can see the basin there in the distance that's been carved by the Merri over the millennia. And then in front of us here, we've got some stony rises that are covered in gorse. This is quite an old photo. And then this sort of low area between the two bands of gorse is a plains grassy wetland, I suppose you could call it, area in the low point between the knolls. Parks Victoria's management of this reserve has been pretty much non-existent until very recently, and that's mostly been due to, I guess, poor planning around how they were going to access the grassland after the Hume Freeway was run along its edge. They didn't have an official way that they could access. So the bridges over the Merri weren't rated to carry vehicles, and the massive bridge over the freeway was rated to carry vehicles. It was designed for fire trucks and so forth to move across it, but they didn't have an access agreement with Vic Roads. So until the last year or two, there's been no management of this grassland by PV. We have managed to do some work in here over the years through various grants, and we've not let the agreement of how to drive over the bridge bother us, which has allowed us to get in there and do some works, really valuable works, I think, focusing on what we see as the key threats to the grassland. So there's a lot of gorse here, which is no longer quite so extensive. It's been peeled back from some of the key knolls, but there's also a host of different threats through here, serrated tussock and Chilean needlegrass, but also lobed needlegrass, which is one of the Nacella family, Nacella caruana, more or less restricted to the city of Whittlesea and a few areas in the city of Hume, and it's present in all of these reserves north of the Ring Road. Yeah, so despite the neglect in this reserve, there's some quite incredible values. So a lot of different pea species present on the knolls. What's that? A Desmodium variance. I can't remember what the common name for that is. Growing amongst some boulders there, but also on the right, we've got Western golden tip, which is sort of a there's a pithy term for it, but anyway, something that bounces back when you expect it to have been extinct. So this one here turned up after a wildfire swept through one of the knolls. There's been no prescribed fire in this reserve, well, since pre-colonial times, really. But wildfire does cause all sorts of things to reappear as the heat cracks open seed coats and that sort of thing. And Western golden tip is an FFG listed species. But in amongst the rocks, there's all sorts of other herbs that may not be threatened, but are pretty much extinct in the Merri. So twining fringe lily, which we've got on the left here, this is the only site that we know that it exists in the catchment, except for probably up around the very top of the catchment, Heathcote Junction, so up in the Great Divide. Similarly, the magenta storksbill, there's 2 other populations that I'm aware of. This is the only one that's in well, within a state managed reserve anyway. But then in those wetlands between the knolls is where there's some really interesting stuff. So there's a remnant population of plains yam daisy, which is there on the right, which is another state critically endangered species. There's a tiny population of about 8 plants growing there. And the one on the left is basalt daisy, Brachyscome pluticola, which also, this is the only population left in the Merri Creek catchment of that plant. So this, even though there hasn't been any work, or there has been limited work going on in the grassland, it's been a very important source of, so we've been able to collect seed from and propagate and reintroduce these plants back into other grasslands. And in the case of the plains yam daisy, through grants, we've been able to actually get into this reserve and try and boost the population from 9 plants up to a few hundred, bringing in some genetics from other populations further up in the Merri Creek catchment. There's some interesting stuff going on down along the in the Melbourne waterland as well, though, just off the grasslands here. Because of that geological feature of the gorge, we've got exposure of the underlying Silurian sediments, which you can see here in the right, peeking out from underneath that boxthorn. So the unconformity has been exposed here, so the area where the basalt and the sedimentary layers meet. So we've got relatively fresh basalts that are about 1 million years ago old up the top here of this gorge, and down the bottom we've got these 400 million year old sediments. And at the meeting point of those 2 different layers is where the groundwater trickles out, because the groundwater's been percolating down through basalt. It's relatively saline, and so we've actually got a vertical salt marsh growing here, a whole host of different species that we more commonly see in coastal areas. Here they're all growing on the escarpment. I included the one on the right because there's also this bizarre outlying population of Senecio linearifolia, which it's not a threatened species, but the particular form here is quite bizarre. It's got unique floral characteristics that the herbariums say possibly are found on a handful of plants in the Brisbane Ranges, but are not otherwise known from anywhere else. So it's could be an undescribed unique species growing here out of this strange salt marsh community. Moving up now to Bubbabee Mining, the Cooper Street grasslands, as they were once known. So here we've got about a 50 hectare or so reserve, again managed by Parks Victoria. There are no access issues to this reserve, so Parks Victoria do carry out management, and as is often the case with Parks Victoria, the rangers themselves are really keen, dedicated people. It's the commitment to funding from other parts of Victoria that's woefully inadequate, really. So there are good people trying to do good things here, but they don't have the resources to actually do it. So some sections of the grassland are like this. They have, severe problems with serrated tussock and other grassy weeds. But there's a lot of progress that has been made getting rid of things like artichoke thistle and some of the woody weeds from most of the reserve. The woody weeds in particular have been greatly reduced. And that's not just down to Parks Victoria, but that's also due to a dedicated group of Friends of Merri Creek volunteers who spent several decades coming out 5 or 6 times a year, the woody weed whackers, as they called themselves, slowly chipping away at the gorse throughout the reserve. So despite the weed issues though, the grassland, it's not quite as diverse as Gulata Tambor, but there's still quite an array of herbs in different areas. So the cutleaf daisy in this photo through some of the drier sections. And then when you get into even drier areas, some quite significant swathes of lemon beauty heads, so population of probably around 1,000 plants spread through the grassland, which is huge really for that species. There's not many reserves with those sort of numbers. And yeah, golden sun moth is something that's really key about this reserve. So in good seasons of golden sun moth, you can see upwards of several thousand moths flying on a sunny day. It'll be interesting to see what happens out there this year now that we've got dry conditions back again. And the last reserve that I'll touch on in detail is Gelgignac, so former Craigieburn grasslands. So it's further north of the other two. And you can see here it's where the Craigieburn bypass wraps around. It's outside. And in this map here, I've also included the orange area represents the conservation areas that have been designated through the Melbourne Strategic Assessment Program. This map actually needs updating. So some of these reserves have been acquired by the state now. They're not just proposed reserves. The area at the south of Gelgignac here has recently been purchased and will be managed by Melbourne Water moving forward, primarily for growling grass frog. So it's part of the growling grass frog conservation area. And the eastern section of this blob up here is the Craigieburn East Grasslands Conservation Area 32, which has also just been purchased and will be managed by Wurundjeri Woiwurrung and the NARAP team in the decades ahead. But as you can see, once the MSA does actually get its act together, if this program comes to full fruition, there'll be quite substantial reserves here around Gelgignac. Anyway, the gazetted Parks Reserve, which is this area in green here, there's about 400 hectares there. Again, it's a Parks Victoria reserve. Parks Victoria do carry out management activities through there, so different parts of the block are burnt. Probably every 4 to 5 years, I would say, is the rotation here. And parks do engage contractors to undertake some works. So, for example, we're working with them at the moment to clean up some of the key knolls in the grassland. But again, the resources parks have is not adequate to dealing with the reserve as a whole. Again, despite the severe weed problems through a lot of the reserve, there are still some really key values through here. So along this tributary of the Merri here is Curly Sedge Creek. It supports a massive population of curly sedge, which is an endangered species in Victoria. And the Curly Sedge Creek in particular is quite interesting, again, because of the saline nature of it. It supports some plants that we don't find on many other parts of the plains until you get again into those saline systems further out west. So brackish plains buttercup being one of them. There's also a form of blown grass, which is of dubious, hasn't been properly described, which could be one of the threatened species as well. And then on the knolls, some of the endangered peas, so Callantenax, tough scurf pea, and other sorts of things growing there as well. So yeah, you can get a sense of the severity of some of the problems in this grassland. So this is serrated tussock all through here, which is not being managed. But then the knolls within the reserve are being well managed. So parks have been targeting especially gorse and artichoke thistle and those sorts of things, sort of radiating out around the knolls. This knoll here, which is just at the southern end of the reserve, sort of straddling parks land and the road reserve, even has a rare form of grevillea here, known in some circles as Latrobe's grevillea. It has a few other names. It hasn't been properly described, and it's probably restricted to here, Calcallo Cemetery, and a few sites along the Plenty Gorge. But yeah, lots of other values spread throughout the grassland. So in some of the lower wet areas, you've got the pale swamp everlasting, which is the one on the left there. Then in the rockier areas rising up from those depressions, you've got a few different varieties of species of scurf pea, like the tough scurf pea here on the right. And then in those saline drainage systems, things like this plant, brackish plains buttercup. So again, another critically endangered in Victoria species, holding on and indeed doing quite well in those saline conditions. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but I just wanted to touch on those reserves and highlight it at the end of her talk. So the Melbourne Strategic Area Assessment conservation areas, some of them have already do now exist as conservation areas and are being managed by different agencies or mismanaged in some cases. So Mount Ridley is managed by Parks Victoria. There's an existing nature conservation reserve there, but some recent additions through the Melbourne Strategic Assessment Program. It's just to the north of Craigieburn. It supports grassy eucalypt woodland, golden sun moth, and there's some really interesting Gilgai formation, so wet depressions there in amongst the grassy eucalypt woodland. Calcallo Commons managed by the City of Hume. It's again quite striking for its wet grassland flora, but also there's some substantial grasslands in the adjoining cemetery, which are not really managed by the Cemeteries Trust, and then some knolls to the south with stony knoll type species, again managed by City of Hume. There's the recently established Craigieburn East grasslands that I mentioned before, but there's also quite a few conservation areas that have yet to come online and may not be properly reserved for several decades. Some of them we have only a vague idea of what's going on there. So the land's private. We've never had access to it. The values aren't particularly well known. So the grassy woodland reserves up at Summerhill Road are some examples of those, as is the the Hume Freeway Conservation Area, as it's called, up at Calcallo. Others, we have a bit more of an idea of what's going on there. So the Bald Hill grasslands, some sections of that conservation area, of what will become that conservation area, we've been working on for many years, engaged by the private landowner. Other sections we haven't laid eyes on for 20 years or more. So we're not really sure what's going on there. And then I guess further to the north, so when we get into the beyond, I guess, the 2008 urban growth boundary, there's the Wallen area that was logically included into the urban growth areas a few years later on. The values within that area weren't included in the biodiversity conservation strategy, unlike the other reserves that we've talked about. So there aren't any conservation areas earmarked up there. There is, however, the proposal for the Wallen Regional Park. It's uncertain what's going to happen in that regard. So the DELP did do a feasibility study a couple of years ago, but I believe it's been sitting on the minister's desk for over a year now. So we're not sure, even though the feasibility study, at least at one stage, identified large areas for restoration. We don't know how that's going to pan out. But yeah, just to finish on, I guess, some bright notes, here's an example of some of the one part of the Bald Hill conservation area. So this is on private property up at Merri. Some really spectacular parts of the creek here that have been managed positively for many years, stock excluded, weeds properly managed, and so forth. And so some really important values have been preserved there. And then some other areas here, this is up in the Wallen area. This is on the rail reserve, north of Beveridge. This area has been almost completely neglected by the rail operator V-Line. But despite that, there's some quite incredible seasonal herbaceous wetlands that have held on here. And I guess when we think about the wider project for the Wallen wetlands and the possibility of restoring some of the swamplands there up near the headwaters of the Merri, this is the kind of vision we have in mind. So things that don't need a vast amount of input to restore, given the right conditions, they'll more or less look after themselves. Yeah, so that's probably it from me. I guess if there are questions for Anne or myself.
Thank you so much, Michael. And that was fascinating. It's great to see the I suppose the depth and length of your corporate knowledge, as it were, like reaching back, and the understanding, like the real detail of these places. That the what you're talking about with species that are, you know, almost locally extinct, and just being aware of those values throughout that is fascinating. One of the things that struck me before I just go through the any questions is and your strategic focus, I suppose, and Michael, like you take a really big picture view of everything, and it seems like you have always done that. Is there what was the motivation behind that, I suppose? Like, how did you get that such a big approach right from the start?
Perhaps I should start by trying to answer that one again. We were much more local when we began in the 70s and probably the early 80s. We were really focused on the degraded rubbish-strewn drain, weed infested drain that was the Merri Creek in the inner northern suburbs. So the bigger picture only developed as the remnant grasslands and grassy eucalypt woodlands were discovered, so to speak, by the botanists from the mid-80s onwards. And so we embraced that new knowledge and I think very, very willingly advocated to protect it, because it was just part of our vision for the creek. We didn't look just at the riparian strip or the creek itself. We were looking at places and values associated with the creek or its tributaries across the whole catchment. So it just developed from there.
And you can talk planning language and visualize things in that sort of, you can frame things in a way that perhaps a lot of conservation groups might not, perhaps.
Yes, well, several of us. I mean, yeah, my background is an environmental planner, and other people in the group had those sort of skills and perspectives too. So I think and good writing skills other people had. So all that helped in presenting arguments and advocating in various formats for what we wanted.
Alex English has a question here. Alex, you can speak it if you prefer to rather than me read it out. But he says, thanks, Anne and Michael, for your great presentations and your amazing work. Are we starting to see more community engagement and advocacy in the middle and upper areas of the Merri Creek, where subdivision is currently happening? Are there examples of good interfaces or improved management in these areas arising from recent community pressure? So yes, the new suburbs.
Michael, could you answer that one?
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess the short answer is no. So we don't have much engagement with the new suburbs. We've found it very difficult to, I guess, even when we are doing activities in some of those new areas, to make contact with the community. So it's been hard even just to make them know that anything's happening. Having said that, we do occasionally get people that, you put up a sign that something's going on and people walk past and surprisingly enough turn up at your activity, but that's pretty few and far between. In terms of how the interfaces are designed though, like I think some of the new estates, there has been some sort of thought around the design. I think often the fences around these grasslands are made to be more welcoming sort of things rather than prohibitive kind of things. There's often signage put in place by councils and so forth, extolling the values of the grasslands, but trying to make clear that these aren't scary places that are full of, pits of snakes. They're beautiful places. They're incredibly valuable places. And, the actual design of having, roads between the houses so people aren't as concerned about fire risk. All those sorts of principles are often quite well applied in some of the newer estates. But yeah, that doesn't necessarily lead to engagement so far.
I can add to that. It's not a new estate particularly, but way up in the top of the catchment, Hidden Valley, just north of Wallen, there's a wonderful rail reserve there. I think Jerry is online listening in, who's involved with Wallen Environment Group, and they've been certainly advocating to protect the vegetation along that unused rail reserve on the edge of the Hidden Valley residential estate. But then also there has been a Friends of Malcolm Creek, which runs through Craigieburn. I'm not sure how active it is at the moment, but they were involved in activities to look after that tributary and its corridor.
Debbie asks why we haven't legally challenged the MSA grasslands as a failure, as a reason to keep. Why hasn't there been a legal challenge to the MSA saying you're just not protecting grasslands?
That's a good question. Are you going to do it, Adrian?
Maybe. I'd love to take someone to court one day. It's just like, but it'd probably be poor old Parks Victoria, I imagine, who'd cop it, which is sort of feels like a bit mean, but nevertheless, it's they're the easiest culprit. But
the state government has failed us. They have failed in their EPBC conditions, so they're the ones we should be challenging. That's what I'm sort of a bit angry about. And you guys have been going for ages longer, and you've lost so much. I'm horrified. I'm upset. I feel terrible. But to me, there's a challenge that should have been done. Someone should have challenged them because they've failed miserably. They failed west, they failed the north. We're only losing constantly. Sorry, just want to ask. I feel like I've been much later in the piece. I wasn't around when I'm not in the Merri Creek area. So
on the flip side though, Deb, that's like, look at the wins these guys have achieved. Like,
you're lucky to have it at all. I get it.
Yeah.
But they failed. The state government failed, and the federal government has let them get away with it.
Yes, they have.
It just sucks. That's all. No other private developer has allowed to do this. That's all. They must fulfil their obligations. So it just beggars belief. That's all. I've been involved in a lot of private development, and they have always had to do it. And they have, if they failed, they've had to do mitigation. They've had to do a lot of stuff. So it just shocks me that they've been able to get away with it. No one seems to care. Sorry.
I think one of the things that's impressed me about Merri Creek Management Committee and so on too is just like all the research you guys do. Like we've been involved in the Golden Sun Moth, the Geelong Strategic Assessment recently, and there's a creek up there, Cowie's Creek, that has a lot of ground and grass frogs on it. And when I've been talking to the people experts about growling grass frogs. It's all, everyone cut their teeth on Merri Creek one way or another, and it's really the science and data that was collected on there that has created the reason for all these conservation areas everywhere else. So that's a pretty amazing thing to have happen. Was there anything deliberate in all of that? Like, have you always, I mean, you're very evidence-based as an organisation. It's, was doing science always part of this? Because you do a lot of science one way or another.
One of the things that contributed to the growling grass frog work, I think I mentioned the gas pipeline and the blockade, and then the growling grass frog trust money, and that funded some of that research. So interesting sort of outcome, guilt money, if you like, you know, compensation for damage done, but it did help pay for some of that frog research.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions that they haven't thrown in the chat? Speak up. I know you want to. No? Okay. Can I just also ask about your range of tactics, I suppose? Like, it's always struck me speaking to people like Brian Bainbridge years ago, just how varied the approaches that you guys have taken to getting engagement with people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Michael, I've said a bit when I talk about various things, you know, but you know, the MCMC's done a lot of other things as well as, you know, besides the friends.
Yeah, look, I guess part of it I think is a sign of the time when MCMC was formed, or, you know, taking off in the early 90s, coinciding with whatever the job, what we now call work for the dollar, I suppose, but quite substantial initiatives in that regard that allowed us to employ, you know, 100 people doing all sorts of different creative things broadly relating to the Merri Creek. So people from a whole host of different backgrounds with, you know, not necessarily ecology skill sets. Bringing those skills and putting them to use. So I think right from the early days of the organisation, there's been a lot of a huge array of different perspectives being harnessed.
Okay. Brooke asks if there is any Indigenous input into the burn regimes you use. Sorry, she doesn't have a working microphone tonight. Yeah,
so to some degree there is. I guess we did, particularly in the early days of the NARAP team, so in the first half of the previous decade, I suppose, we did quite a lot of burning with NARAP. I guess initially following our, you know, the sort of traditional European methods. I don't know what else you'd call them, of, you know, burning strips, large squares, whatever, non-natural sort of ways. But later, particularly when NARAP started to develop, I guess, increase their own understanding of cultural burning and so forth. Babi Jinanang, that first grassland I talked about, we have done some cool burning there with NARAP. And we have, at least for some of the grassland burns we do, adopted some of those principles. So burning in cooler conditions on a smaller sort of scale, single ignition points, so slower sort of burns that move slowly outwards rather than big strips of flame. We have adopted some of those principles. We haven't always been able to do that because I guess in a lot of these grasslands, it's a thing, it's a balancing act between wanting to do the best approach, which would be cool burning, I think, versus the area that you sort of want to cover so that you don't neglect other areas by not being able to burn them because you don't have resources, because burning's always a resource intensive kind of thing, and we don't always have the funds to do it properly, I suppose. But yeah, we are certainly moving towards using those principles more and more where we can.
You've always had a very First Nations perspective too. Would I be right? Like the naming of those grasslands up the creek and so on. That was the first time. Well, I don't know. Was it the first time that naming like that had been undertaken? And like, what was your role in that?
But that, I don't know whether it's the first time. I mean, obviously, a lot of our place names are Aboriginal, you know, whether have been adopted all lots of places around Australia. But in the recent times, it was the Friends of Merri Creek secretary, Ray Radford, who's secretary for many years. He approached Wurundjeri, and one or two of the elders did choose names for those significant sites, particularly those grassland sites that we were talking about, all based on the body of the mother. So the creek is the sort of skeleton, the spine, and the names relate to body parts of the mother. So it's an interesting story. Yeah, and that was I don't know, 15, 20 years ago that those names were given by one of the Wurundjeri elders, but it's taken a long time for the agencies such as Parks Victoria to get them officially adopted as place names.
They're very powerful thing to have done. And now look, Merri-bek is Merri-bek, for heaven's sake. Who knows? Perhaps it was all because of that. So there's another question here, sorry, from Kath Rawlings. How does burning impact Chilean needlegrass or serrated tussock? What's the best method of eradication?
Yeah, so burning promotes both of those weeds. They're weeds from a very similar kind of climate to what we have in Victoria. The parts of South America that they're from, they're adapted to fire-prone environments. Burning opens up space, which allows them to harness more sunlight and so forth, germinate by the million. So if all you do is burn, and there's those Chilean needlegrass, serrated tussock involved, you're probably making things worse. So we burn areas where we have the resources to actually do follow-up. And I guess a lot of this, so coming through with selective herbicides afterwards and doing very slow, painstaking, detailed work to try and knock those species out. In terms of eradicating it, though, yeah, except for on a very small scale, I don't know of anywhere where people have been successful getting rid of Chilean needlegrass, at least. Serrated tussock's a bit of a different story. You can knock that out of grasslands without a huge amount of trouble, but Chilean needlegrass, because it just forms this front and drops its seed by the million, and the seed lasts for years in the soil, it's very hard to get rid of once it's entrenched. The only real way of, the best thing to do is just not let it get in there in the first place if you can.
Famous last words, yes. So how do you, Lorian Francis asks, how do you talk to people about burning, especially when the grasslands are right next to their houses?
Yeah, so I guess with the examples of Ngari Jarring, that second grassland we looked at is probably the best example of that, where you've got houses backing right up onto the property. And we've been doing it for such a long time there. So fires have been happening for 30 years. The use of fire in the grassland predates most of those houses being built. I wasn't around for those difficult conversations when it was all happening, but I guess these days it's a given. We actually get complaints in the years when we aren't able to burn for whatever reason from residents. Oh, why haven't you burnt it? It's all looking overgrown, blah, blah, blah. But people expect fire to happen. I guess we do, quite extensive leaded leafleting in the lead up to a burn. We door knock most of the surrounding houses on the day of the burn to let them know that, there's fire happening, there's going to be smoke. close your windows, take your clothes off the line, those sort of things. So people have always been aware. Most of those residents have always been aware that there's fire happening, and you do sometimes still get negative complaints, but not really.
So have you turned the people around? Like, do they like the grassland?
Oh, it depends who you talk to. I think most of them accept the grasslands.
Pretty good
I think,
start.
yeah. People do enjoy. I mean, again, Nari Jarang, as an example, it's right there in the middle of suburbia, but it's got a permanent population of kangaroos hanging out there, and people do enjoy those sort of obvious aspects of the fauna they can see. Maybe not so much the snakes, but yeah, certainly kangaroos, those sorts of things. So on some level, there's an appreciation by some people.
Debbie says Moonee Valley Council do it easily now too. They burn every year, 2 years, no problem. Yes, indeed. So it has, people are becoming accepting of it. Look, we're coming up to 8 o'clock. Are there more questions that anyone would like to throw into the mix? I could keep asking Michael and Anne questions all night because I just think their organisations are amazing. But that's just me. It's all right. Well, perhaps we should wind up then. Thank you so very much, Michael, Anne. It's very incredibly informative and great to just see the scale and the history of what your organisations have achieved over time. It's a beacon of shining light. That's what it is. There you go. Better stop me there before I start to gush too much. Thank you.